So welcome to our session, The Art of Mobile Interviewing, presented by Astha Trivedi and Seetha Annamraju. And let's introduce them. So Seetha is a mobile engineering manager at Cash App. She was an Android engineer before that for almost a decade at various companies in the Bay Area, including Amazon, Cash App, Velos Mobile, and Project Ronin. She's also a mock interviewer at Interview Kickstart and has spoken at various tech conferences, including DroidCon and 360 and Dev on numerous topics. She's driven recruiting process improvements at various companies and cares deeply about helping underrepresented folks discover their strengths and identify better career opportunities. Seetha likes to spend her free time traveling and spending time in nature. Astha Trivedi is a senior iOS engineer at Cash App in San Francisco. She graduated with a CS degree in 2010 and worked in the mobile industry as an iOS engineer for over a decade at companies including Netflix, Intuit, Apple, and now Block. As a mobile engineer, sometimes the only woman and or a person of color in a team, she has experienced the different shades of the industry, including interviewing and being interviewed. She's passionate about sharing knowledge and her experiences to build skills and wisdom collectively for others in tech. In her spare time, she loves to sketch landscapes and animals. So after the two of you present, we will then have a discussion round. So please send in your folks in the Q&A in the tab in here, and over to you folks.
Thanks, Navati. Hey, welcome to this interactive session, The Art of Mobile Interviewing. My name is Seetha. I'm a mobile engineering manager at Cash App, and this is Astha.
Hi, I'm Astha. I'm a senior iOS engineer at Cash App.
So how many of you have ever been in a terrible interview? Maybe because the interviewer wasn't great, or you weren't prepared, you forgot your resume, or anything like that. Type it in the chat, yes or no. So it might not be obvious, but if you really think about it, almost everyone in tech has probably had at least one bad interviewing experience. Astha, do you want to share your worst interviewing experience?
Yes, one of the worst experiences I've had was a coding screen where I was asked to only use deprecated APIs and share my screen all the time. I was prohibited from using Google at all. So whenever I would just pause typing, the interviewer would assume that I'm cheating somehow and try to call me out on it. It was a very stressful experience.
Wow, that does sound horrible. As you can see, a lot can go wrong during an interview, but setting your expectations properly, preparing for the interview, and applying some tricks during the interview itself will help set you up for success. We're here today to share our learnings with you based on many years of experience in this industry, being on both sides of the interview. First, we'll talk about how to prepare for an interview, and I don't mean just doing leak code all day, every day. Second, how do you bring your best self to the interview itself? What do you do if the interview isn't going as planned? And third, how do you figure out what to do if you have multiple offers? Or how do you handle a rejection gracefully and take those learnings forward? And this is meant to be an interactive Q&A, so we'll leave plenty of time at the end for you to ask specific questions. This talk is best suited for engineers that are just starting out in mobile or looking for the next mobile role. All right, let's dive right in. The first and probably most important step in this process is preparation. This is important because it's in your control. Let's visualize for a minute. Think about your dream role or company. Think about your dream salary, and then add some to it. What does that look like? How does your day-to-day look? What would your manager be like? What is the team and engineering culture like? And what does growth look like to you? So what's holding you back from achieving all of this or more? Well, a lot of times it's our secret enemy, imposter syndrome. If you've never heard this phrase, imposter syndrome is where you feel like an imposter. It's all the what if questions that come up. What if they find out I'm not good enough? what if I got this far by luck? And I want you to know that almost everyone, starting from individual contributor all the way to CEO, CTO, faces imposter syndrome at one point or another. Type in the chat if you've ever faced imposter syndrome or an inner critic that's stopping you from growing. And you can just type yes or no. I see folks answering yes. What about if you recognize the issue? Now what? Well, did you know that women tend to not apply for roles unless they match 100% of the description? But we're here to tell you that if you fit 60% of the description, it's good enough to apply. Astha, do you want to share your experiences with imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so my imposter syndrome is at strongest when I'm done with the interview and I've just joined the company, because I feel like I somehow tricked everyone into thinking that I'm really good, but now I have to prove myself. So I put undue pressure on myself to do more and more. In these kind of situations, I try to remember that, all of the achievements that I've had so far are the ones that are done by me, nobody else.
That's a really good point, and that's fantastic advice. Exactly like Asa said, focus on the facts or past successes. You're the one that got yourself here, so if you focus on that, you can take the next leap. There are also some things that will help you with imposter syndrome and general interview prep. One of these is preparing your narrative or story and really understanding your strengths. Pop quiz. What is the most commonly asked question in an interview? If you know the answer, type it in the chat. If you're thinking of binary search trees or maybe sorting, you would actually be wrong. It's actually, tell me about yourself and what you've been working on. The worst answer I've gotten in an interview to this question was, well, you have my resume, so I don't think I have anything else to say beyond that. The answer to this question, though, is your first impression of the company and also what they will probably remember the most. So let's start by identifying your strengths. What are things that your friends and colleagues commonly say you're doing well? Or maybe it keeps coming up as a positive thing in your performance reviews. Make sure that these qualities are coming across in your elevator pitch, which, by the way, is usually 1 to 2 minutes long. Choose one project in your pitch that highlights the type of technical or leadership skills that make sense for this role. So essentially, align your narrative with the role that you're applying to. The next thing to prepare for are a list of experiences in STAR format that explain how you work. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. The most commonly asked behavioral or leadership questions are around project management and communication. And these are designed to understand how you work. How is it like working with you? How well do you collaborate? How do you communicate? And what does good project management look like to you? And what do you do when you're faced with conflict? Come up with strong examples around each of these points. And if you can't think of particular examples, try to think about what you would do in these situations. And also think about scope and impact of your work. What are 2 to 3 major projects that went well that you played a key role in? In those projects, did you influence decision making? How did you handle collaboration? Did you convince a team to do something? Or was your key project influencing other projects? And once you've finished creating this overall narrative, it's time to focus on your technical portfolio. Now I'll hand it off to Astha to talk about technical portfolio.
Okay, so what is a technical portfolio? It's a list of projects that can showcase your hands-on skill set. These projects can be from your work, open source projects, or a personal one. Definitely have a personal project if you're new to mobile. So personal projects are great because they cultivate practical learning. You can learn new technologies by applying them to your project. But how do you choose what to build? Sometimes we end up coming up with this really impressive mountain of an application, which can be really overwhelming. Instead, start with a single screen application, and you can add features to it. The key here is to make something that you see yourself using. Now, question to the audience. How many pages is your resume? Type it in the chat. One, two, I see a 1.75 years somewhere. Yeah, so usually 1 to 2 pages is a good limit. Okay, so here are some tricks you can use to make sure your resume showcases your best work. Only add topics that you can comfortably talk about in depth. If something's not adding value to your brand, remove it. Make sure there are no grammar mistakes or typos, and your resume is easy to understand. Highlight keywords that you want the reader to pay attention to, but don't overdo it. Now, so far, you have your narrative, your portfolio, and your resume. Next is interviews. Now, in this section, we will talk about technical screens and the tracks available for it, how to prepare for each track, and how to tackle difficult interviews. And also, what to ask the company that you're interviewing for. Now, there are 2 types of tracks available for tech screens. One is a mobile track, which has take-home exercises, mobile-specific coding screens. And the other one is a tech standard track, which has algorithm questions like data structures and general problem-solving questions like string manipulations or game building. Now, suppose a company gives you a choice between them. How do you pick? Well, there are pros and cons to both, so let's go through them. Take-home projects allow you to demonstrate your skill set in a very flexible way. So you can work at your own pace. You're usually limited to 4 to 6 hours, but there is no hard cutoff. And the skills you need are the same skills you use on a day-to-day job if you're working in mobile already. Now, the biggest con here is that it is time-consuming, especially when you're interviewing with multiple companies. If you're new to mobile, this can be very difficult because you may not be familiar with the standard developer patterns. Now, here are some key things your project gets graded on. One is, does your app work as per the requirements? Second is, how is the user experience? Does the UI look presentable? Did you use a standard design pattern for the data flow? Did you add anything extra you wanted to show off, like maybe an animation on a button click or a screen transition? And lastly, this is very important, how is your app performing? That means your app shouldn't crash or hang while you're using it. Keeping all of these things in mind, you can build a great take-home application. Now, Seetha, what grabs your attention in a take-home project?
When I'm evaluating, I love seeing a good separation of concerns in the code. And also really like when someone has put in the effort to build a good user experience, especially since we're a product team. But red flags are when someone doesn't take the effort to clean up their code or they just forgot to write tests.
+1 on that. So let's talk about the other track available to you. Honestly, coding screens are a great option if you don't have the time for a take-home or you're just new to mobile. There are tons of resources out there for you to practice as many questions as you want. And pro tip, focus on lead code style questions as much as possible, but don't forget to practice object-oriented style questions as well. Keep in mind that coding interviews generally have very little to do with your mobile role. So your interview may also not be, a mobile engineer. So if you have any mobile specific questions, they may not be the best person to answer that question. Now, say you have chosen the track and the company now has a way to evaluate you. But what about the other way around? Now, it's important to remember that an interview is a two-way conversation. It's an opportunity for you to get all the information you need so that you can make an informed decision if you get an offer. Now, what do you ask them? There are some common areas you can ask questions about. So first is tech stack, like what does the infrastructure look like? What languages do they use? What does project management look like in the company? And what are you expected to do when you join and contribute? What does the interaction look like between stakeholders other than mobile, say design, server, analytics, or marketing? Now, on-call schedule is actually very important because a bad on-call schedule can affect your work-life balance a lot. And lastly, why are they hiring? What is the vision for their product? Seetha, do you want to share, your favorite question you asked your interviewer?
Sure. So back when I was interviewing, I used to like to ask questions about project management and prioritization. So a good question like, how do you handle conflicting priorities? And this helps me understand if the team has a clear process in place to prevent scope creep. And sometimes also helps me understand if there's too much thrash or possible tendency towards burnout on the team.
And you should be very mindful about burnout. So +1 on that as well. Okay, so now let's assume you are prepared and you're in an interview, but it is not going well. So despite that, there are ways to navigate them. First, you can share your thought process and state your assumptions very clearly. Now, this will allow your interviewer to witness how you actually solve problems. When you're struggling, your interviewer may give you cues or hints so pay attention to them because they want you to succeed. And it might point you to a new direction to solve the problem after all. And lastly, take a break and breathe. Okay, another question to the audience. What advice do you have to folks to tackle a difficult interview?
Breathing, that's a good one.
Yeah. Maybe ask for a few seconds, right? That's, very acceptable. Seetha, what about you?
So I've seen a lot of candidates struggle during interviews, but it's important to have the awareness of what your skill gap looks like and identify approaches to move forward. So I've seen multiple candidates that got hired even though they didn't do perfectly in the interview because they called out exactly what they don't know and also followed up with what they would do to approach the answer. And this self-awareness and willingness to develop are really strong indicators of success. And a good interview process or a good interviewer should be able to identify this. Also, don't underestimate the value of good communication.
I completely agree. Good communication can take you a long way. Okay, so beyond this, I would like Seetha to talk about post-interview. Seetha, go ahead.
All right. So you got through the hard stage of the interviewing process. It's time to reflect back on your dream role that we talked about again. Can you set priorities by what you're looking for? What are your must-haves? If you got multiple offers, do any of them align with those priorities or must-haves? Because this will help you choose an offer without introducing bias. But on the flip side, let's say you got rejected from the company. Try to think about why it may have happened, but don't dwell on it. Everyone goes through rejection at some point in their career. A lot of times, it's probably not you. Every human interviewer comes with some bias, and people have a tendency to choose no, even if they're a little bit unsure about a candidate. Or maybe the business requirement has changed and they just no longer need you. All right, so we went through a ton of content, but here's what I would like you to leave the session with. Apply for a job before you feel 100% ready. Don't let imposter syndrome stop you. Take that leap anyway. Take time, really take time to identify your strengths and prepare your narrative. Make sure you highlight your strengths that align with that role. If you're given a choice between take home versus coding screens, figure out what's better for you based on your skill set, how much time you have, and also whether you perform better in a live setting or on your own. And remember that interviewing is a two-way conversation. Ask good questions to figure out if the company is right for you. But if you were rejected from the company anyway, use it as a learning opportunity for next time. Most importantly, don't give up. Your dream opportunity is still possible if you put in the effort and spend time identifying your strengths. So now we would like to open it up for a Q&A if you have any questions for us. Astha, can you drop in this list of resources into the chat as well?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Astha and Seetha, for this amazing set of slides, and the checklist was awesome. I've made some notes, and also for highlighting that, especially as a beginner, to work on one-page mobile apps rather than, being too ambitious and overwhelming yourself. So these were amazing, and we have so many questions. So I'll get started, and folks keep posting your questions if you have some more. Well, here's one. There were a couple of questions related to, transitioning and resume gaps. So any advice on how to present a resume for someone who is shifting careers? I couldn't help but add some paragraphs to explain my path, even though I know it's not recommended.
Did you say if there are resume gaps?
And that's another question, so that's kind of similar, but I mean, in the same category, but yeah. But this one's more about transitioning and wanting to explain, like this person is wondering whether they should add some more information to explain their path, even though maybe it's kind of not related to mobile. That's what I understand. But, to kind of explain their situation.
Okay, gotcha. Astha, do you want to take this or should I?
Yeah, sure, I can. Oh, why don't you start?
All right. So I think it's important to keep things as relevant as possible because it gives an opportunity for whoever is evaluating you to get thrown off track. So if you have enough experience in mobile, try to remove anything that's irrelevant, especially if it's much older.
Okay. And also, like, what do you think about resume gaps? If you have a gap for whatever reason, and I know companies are getting better at accepting that, and they should be, but do you have any tips around that?
I can take that. So honestly, like you said, the companies are getting much better at accepting that. We don't live in a world, especially in the tech industry, where there is prejudice against taking a gap because you had to take care of a loved one or you had a child. So be honest, because life happens, and if companies are trying to judge you based on your life circumstances, then maybe think about whether that company is actually right for you.
Yeah, that's true. And I'd like to add, just for the audience in here, Women Who Code is a great place for folks transitioning. I myself transitioned, and it was really helpful. So yeah, when it comes to choosing the kind of interview, someone is asking, can you choose which kind of interviews you're going to do between taking take-home tests and the algorithm ones? I guess they're trying to figure out if you can actually negotiate that. And I'd add to that also, I know you mentioned how you could choose between the two. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I will add to that is that, you know, there are more companies right now that let you choose, or if you are coming in for a mobile, track and you have experience in mobile already, they have a mobile track set for you completely, right? But then, there are a few traditional companies left in the industry that do not take that route. They're adamant about, the algorithmic questions, and that's just the reality. So, you may have the majority of the companies that you may talk to, you may have the choice, but some of them you may not.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I would say it's always worth asking whether there are other options for you. Um, but one thing I feel is if a company has invested the time to build out a mobile framework, I have this bias that maybe they give enough importance to the mobile side of things as well. So
Yeah.
I tend to like companies that offer a mobile track. So think about like where you will perform best.
That's true. Yeah, you need to apply to companies that you actually want to work with in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, and another question that I want to add as a follow up to that is, um, what do you think about negotiating the time that you're given to do the take home interview? Because I've noticed that, at least in my experience, companies are like, okay, hand this over in 3 days. Those 3 days could be 3 week days where you're, like busy with other things, your own work or other interviews as well. So what do you think about negotiating that and asking for maybe a week or something?
I think definitely ask for the time that you need to perform your best. So, the good thing about take homes is that it gives you the flexibility. Let's say you have childcare responsibilities or anything like that. You can spread this take home over the span of 2 weeks and put in an hour a day or something, or an hour or half an hour a day or something. Um, and that's really valuable. Um, the other thing is in relation to time, there's no way to tell like how if you spent 4 to 6 hours or more. So if you need that extra 30 minutes, like spend that extra 30 minutes. Unless you've built something that's production ready and like people know it's obviously not within a span of a day, it's not a big deal if you spend an extra half an hour. So I think there's that advantage there too.
Yeah, and when it comes to assumptions, right? You talked about dealing with those assumptions, and now let's say it's a take-home test, so most likely you're going to correspond through email. Do you think it's wasting time to go back and forth? And usually there might be an HR as an intermediate, so it does take a little time. What do you think about that? Or do you recommend that one states their assumptions in their project itself and say, in the comments or something, and say, these are my assumptions, and I went ahead with that?
I can speak for it from my own personal experience. There have been times where, the requirements are not completely clear to me. And most of the time, what I do is, if I only have the recruiter's contact, I'll ask them to get me in touch with the hiring manager so that I can, be, in a more active communication with them. Sometimes, the APIs they give are not working. Like that has happened to me where the server API is just not sending back data anymore. What do you do then, right?
Yeah.
So I have been in situations where I have actually corresponded with them on a daily basis, trying to get these things set up and asking questions. And, I think it was well received because I ended up getting a job offer and ended up joining the company, because you are trying to make sure that the time you're putting in and that time you're investing in, you are using it the right way, and you're clarifying things without just instead of just going off and building something on your own. And these are valuable qualities that people look for.
That's true. Yeah. I've had that experience too with an API not working. So I don't know if they were testing me or if it was intentional. But yeah, there are a couple of questions on design interviews, on system design interviews. So one is, what should one cover for mobile system design interviews? And then there's another question, are there system designing questions for mobile interviews, and what is usually asked there?
So if I'm understanding this correctly, so I mean, The mobile system design interviews could be, how you're building an application. So there could be an entire interview where just you're basically whiteboarding uh, all of the components needed to build an application. And that could mean, a server off somewhere that is sending you, data. So, think about, like, for these kind of questions, it's all about, having a bird's eye vision of the requirements, and, like, making sure that any information and stuff you need, you put a source there, like, where is this coming from? If you need this information, how would an app communicate with this? So generally it's about, architecture, application building, and it could go beyond just the application and include database and server as well.
Yeah, when I see this, when I approach this question, I try to break down the entire architecture into different things. So like you might have UI, you have storage, you have networking, you have data flow. Try to break these down, maybe even like on your whiteboard or virtual whiteboard, break it down into sections and talk about each thing separately. And at the end of it, you should be able to know really well. Like if I give you a scenario, a user is typing search, what is happening? I want you to be able to walk through the entire network layer, the entire UI layer. Like if there's a view model, how are these interactions happening? So for mobile system design interviews, my recommendations are to look at your production app, like how that works, and look at sample apps that are out there that are really good. There's a bunch on by Google that are common architecture patterns like MVVM. Why would you choose one pattern over the other? And what are other things that you need to think about beyond, say, UI? Can you give me an example of UX? Have you thought about, I love when people talk to me about accessibility and offline mode, and they're talking about like all these other things that they would consider in a production app, because that mindset is what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's true. Like you said, offline and caching and all, those are important considerations for mobile. And there is another follow-up to this. So they're asking no backend server scalability, load balancing questions for mobile. So what do you think? Like, should one focus on those more server-like questions, or just focus more, like you talked about, mobile and more like on the front end?
Yeah, I think it's gonna. Oh, go ahead, Astha.
Go ahead.
I think it's gonna depend on the type of company you're interviewing for. Usually, the hiring manager, or sorry, the recruiter will tell you what the entire interview process is going to be like, and you can always ask for sort of guides of like how to prepare. And if they say it's going to be a system interview that's not mobile focused, then going back to your normal like lead code style, grokking system design interview style questions and practicing those is important. But if you know they say, okay, this is a mobile friendly interview, we're going to ask mobile specific system design questions, focus on that.
That makes sense, to clarify with the recruiter. And on that note, do you have any resources that you recommend? Because I know that there's this famous couple of books for system design interviews, but apart from that, do you recommend anything else, especially if it's mobile? There are not that many resources, at least that I know of, so I think this would benefit everyone here.
I think the ones that we posted in the chat are quite useful. CodePath, okay. If you want to kind of get paid service, Interview Kickstart is a good option to do mock interviews. Also, just look at the sample projects by Google for at least I'm speaking to Android, but look at those sample projects, especially for architecture components and like Jetpack Compose. How have they built the apps? Because that's kind of a good way to leverage sample projects, like understand the architecture and see why things are broken down the way they are.
Yeah, I think that. Sorry, you said something.
Just to add a couple of things about iOS in this case, like Apple reference documentation, or like the website usually has a lot of sample applications, and you can find a lot of them in GitHub as well. And maybe GitHub would be a better source than Apple, because they may have things like caching and network requests attached to them. The one of the resources we posted was Ray Wenderlich, which has both Android and iOS related resources in there, and they do talk. They have some tutorials and articles where they talk about different kind of design patterns that you can use in your application. So that could be a great resource for you as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that investigative nature definitely helps, like poking around a bit and being curious. So that's a great tip. Like while you're at your job, even if you're not preparing for interviews. And yeah, you mentioned Ray Vanderlex. I just want to mention, folks, you can win that giveaway. You can take part in a social media giveaway as well as at the end of the session. So I had another question, like, if a company uses a certain framework, to what extent should one research it if they haven't used it already? So, for example, if a company is using Combine or Jetpack Compose or something even more, something that you're not even really found as popular, let's say. So, do you think it's worth spending a little time researching it, and how much time? And or just saying, yeah, I don't know about this.
Do you want to answer this?
Yeah, sure. I was trying to figure out who speaks about this first. Okay, so yeah, so I mean, if it's a requirement for the role, then it's good to have an opinion on it. If you have experience in it, then they're going to ask questions. But if you don't have enough experience or you don't know anything about it, research it enough so that you can form an opinion and talk about it. But it's okay to be open in the interview saying that, hey, I actually don't have any hands-on experience, but this is what I think about it.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
The other, based on the framing of this question, this can also be an opportunity for you to show a strength. So if you identify, hey, I don't know this technology, but like here's how I would go about learning it. These are the type of resources I usually approach to figuring this out. Like maybe I build a sample app with that technology. Maybe I go to particular forums where it's available to you, where discussions are happening around it. Things like that.
I love that answer. Yeah, that's awesome. Like, you get to talk about your learning style and you show your enthusiasm. That's brilliant. And similar to that, like, do you recommend just like as you're working on your career and your job, do you recommend being more of an expert in the basic fundamentals? So if it's like Android, then like knowing the Android OS and Kotlin or Swift and iOS. Or do you also recommend spending some time, and how much time, learning newer frameworks and tools, because the updates there never end?
Yeah, I think I can say that it's always nice to have experts. So whenever we're saying, okay, we're hiring for say L4s or L5s, if a good senior engineer comes along, or someone that has expertise in a particular area, maybe they're not a senior engineer, that's still looked upon favorably. So being an expert in one area is always valuable. But again, like I think both of us have the opinion that if you don't know a particular technology, or there are a bunch of new things coming up, try to understand why they happened. What is the historical context for Jetpack Compose? Like, what about the existing UI framework was insufficient, or what is this an improvement of? And then form an opinion on it. Like, be able to ask good questions on it. And I think that's the level that I would recommend.
The only thing I'll add to that is that, teams need both kind of engineers. Teams need, experts who have depth of knowledge in certain areas, and they also need experts who are more of generalists, but they have a really good basic foundation. So it's not really about, one or the other, because these two things actually build a great team because they work really well together.
That's true. Yeah. And then Audrey asks, what questions would you suggest asking? And I know you came up with a list there, but is there anything else you want to add? And I have a question that I would like to ask them too, and I can maybe ask you right now. This is something I'm curious about. What are your thoughts on asking the team that you're interviewing with about their priorities towards refactoring their code base, and how open they are to changes? Because I know that sometimes you join a team and then you're like, these guys are not open to suggestions, and you get more frustrated with maybe the existing flaws, and So is that a reasonable question to ask them? And any other questions that you have in mind?
Seetha, you want to start?
Sure. So I think it's always important to understand whether a team has the space, the time and the space to slow down and improve work that they've done. And that's a really good indicator of, am I just like shipping, or am I slowing down, really trying to, this is not just about refactoring. This is about building great user experiences. Have I measured things? Like, am I acting on measurements and metrics, or am I just building for the sake of building? And I think that's a really important question to ask. Like, how do you improve your product? Like, what does maintenance of your project look like? How does rollout look like? How does refactoring look like? Especially when you have other features that need to happen. How do you prioritize refactoring? That's a good question. Another good question unrelated to this is just to ask about work-life balance. I've seen people ask me whether that's a good question to ask, because they might give off the impression that they're not ready to put in the hard work. And I've had someone tell me, like, I don't like people asking about work-life balance because it makes me feel like they don't want to work. And I think that's a good indicator of a company that maybe you want to think more about, because a lot of companies now are moving towards providing a good atmosphere for working, especially now that we're remote. And so, like, seeing the answer to that question, just seeing the reaction, is good.
Makes sense. Yeah. And so Smriti had this question, like, how do you handle a rude interviewer or an interview that is going poorly? And we talked about tough interviews, but there are also, interviewers who are just rude, just biased, or, whatever. So
Yeah.
what do you recommend?
So, I mean, right off the bat, the first thing I will say is, no matter how that interview goes, definitely give feedback on that interviewer. Contact the recruiter you've been talking to and explain what that experience was, and how things could have been handled differently, and do that right away, as as much as it's like fresh in your mind and you're still in the process. Because if you're still a candidate waiting on feedback, you're still the candidate they have like a focus light on, right? So use that focus light to surface up any of these issues that you bring up. Sometimes we feel like that the emails we send to the recruiter after we're done interviewing just like goes in their trash can or something, but that's not actually true. Especially if you send feedback, they always circle back to it. And maybe if you came across a rude interviewer and you shared what happened, maybe they'll just like put them out of the circulation for a little bit and provide some training for them, so you can make a difference there.
I agree.
Yeah,
100%.
Yeah. And you talked about how sometimes you don't hear back. So Filene had a question. There are companies that don't share the actual reason for rejection. How do you suggest to still ask for specific reasons so that you can use the honest feedback to improve yourself?
I think this is just a really hard thing for interviewers, because we're told not to share feedback, and that could be for multiple reasons. But I do think asking an interviewer, hey, are you willing to provide feedback? It doesn't hurt to ask. Is there anything I should focus on in my next round? Is there anything I can do better? Are there any aspects of my interview that were that I should continue working on, something along those lines. And sometimes people will respond back, recruiters will respond back. They might give you very generic feedback of like, oh, your code wasn't clean enough. And that could mean anything, but take a look at your project again and see like, oh, did you not clean up something? Did you leave dependencies that didn't need to be there? So they might give somewhat vague feedback, but try to make it turn it into an actionable thing. You can also ask if there's particular rubrics that they're willing to share, because most companies will have a rubric that they focus on when grading projects. So if they can share that, that can help you as well.
Yeah. And I mean, some companies, they they want to leave the door open if you want to reapply. So, if you talk about that, hey, I want to reapply maybe like in another 6 months, where would you want me to focus my energy on while preparing for the next time? They might be interested in helping you out because, it's totally okay to reapply. I've known people who've gone through multiple interviews before they landed, their dream job or dream company, and that's totally fine. And don't be disappointed if they still don't get back to you, because that's just a harsh reality we may have to live with.
Right. Yeah, and we are at time, but if you have a couple of minutes, we can go over a couple of more questions, or we can proceed to the next sessions. I want to be mindful of everyone's time here, so let me know.
I'm okay. We have time.
Okay. Yeah, so there were some folks who were talking about how they, they're worried about making a transition later on in their careers. Do you have anything that you'd like to share in this regard?
So, it actually, I would say that, suppose you worked in, web for 20 years, and then you decided to switch to mobile. There may be some steep learning curve in the beginning, but, this is actually a very common thing you see, especially with people who are career engineers who don't want to switch their tracks to, say, management or some other, or some other area of expertise. So, and like when it comes to steps you can take, they're, very similar to, somebody who's just getting into mobile in the beginning. But the good thing is, a lot of languages, as you go along, they learn from each other, they take from each other. So you will always have areas that you can take, like learnings you can take from your personal, like from your previous experience, and convert it into a mobile experience.
That's true. There are a lot of transferable skills.
Yeah.
So Nancy was asking, is there a minimum number of apps that you recommend listing in your resume or portfolio?
I don't think there's a minimum. I think it's what the apps are showcasing and how large are the apps. If it's a single screen app and you have 3 of them, that's a good number. If you have one app, 1 or 2 apps that are just pretty medium to large apps, that's that counts for something too. So it's not always about how many you have. So especially because one screen app is a lot easier to build compared to something that's a little larger that maybe has been in the App Store for a while, and you might want to refactor things, you might want to maintain things. So that gives you different experiences to talk about compared to a single screen app.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, one last question. Do bringing up bugs in the app count as driving impact in your team?
I have some thoughts on this, and then I'll let Astha go as well. So the bugs on their own don't count as large scope and impact, but if you can put that together into a project. So again, this goes back to identifying strengths and creating a narrative. But if you can put all those bugs together, create a project around it and say, like, this is a general improvements, like, or you did an UI improvements project, or like performance improvements for this app v2, whatever, right? Like label it something and have a good chunk of work that that is visible. Like make sure it's visible, make sure it's impactful, and that it's not just like 2 or 3 things. And over time, like if people have observed and called out like, hey, this has improved the performance of our app by X%, like if you can put a number on it, that's even better. Or increase ratings in a certain amount. So try to align on those numbers, something numerical, something like that can be grouped into a bigger project is my recommendation.
Yeah,
I think the only thing I'll add to that is, while speaking about the projects, in your narrative or, in the interview, there are, I would say there are only like maybe 1 or 2 exceptions to what Seetha said. And that's coming from like personal experience where, suppose there was this, issue that nobody could figure out and it's affecting users' experience. And you're the one who had to dive in, spend a lot of time to actually, figure out why that is happening. And, you were persistent, you looked at it objectively, you rallied people around to figure out the context around it, and you found a solution. So this actually shows how much you're willing to focus on this one thing, get your hands dirty, and find a solution. Like basically pull everything together to take something to the finish line. So those are the that's something that you can speak a lot towards. Like I'm usually really proud of the times when I caused a bug and then I fixed it, and it was a bad one.
And I think one thing to point out there is that's an example of a really impactful work. And it might not seem that way if you just say, hey, I fixed the bug. But let's say it's about the framing of how you did this, right? Like what Astha said, pulling people together, creating sync meetings, like updating the right people, like making sure maybe you had to roll back, keeping rollout from getting to too many people, things like this. Like, have you created awareness around this? Have you taken steps to that solution, and like rallying people together? Like all these that's the biggest piece of that. The impact. It's not, so make sure you frame things properly.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah, sorry, that makes a lot of sense. And driving impact, that's the main aspect of this. So I want to thank both of you. Thank you, Astha, and thank you, Seetha, for presenting on this essential skill, the art of interviewing. And I learned a lot. I realized that it's a lot of reflecting during your own job so that you are prepared for the interview when it does come around. And so yeah, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for everyone who attended right now. And do know there's an amazing bunch of talks after this. So do check out the schedule and attend them, and also post about it so that you can win the Ray Vanderlei giveaway. So thank you, and see you around soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.